We are now joined in the studio by the President, National Association for Energy Economics, Professor Yinka Omorogbe. I hope I got that correctly, ma'am.
You did okay.
Thank you. Senior Advocate of Nigeria. She was the former Secretary and Legal Advisor to the NNPC between 2009 and 2011, and also former Attorney General and Commissioner for Justice in Edo State. It's a pleasure to have you join us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Looking at your profile and looking at your face, there seems to be a mismatch. You seem to be growing younger rather than adding those numbers. It's a pleasure to have you join us, break down what appears to be like a conversation in the blues for most Nigerians. For them, a functional NNPC, it's when they drive into the filling stations and they get regular supplies of fuel, when they understand that we seem to be making money from the sales of crude oil, or when the refineries are working, when they recover from what appears to be an eternal, perpetual turnaround maintenance and all of that. What is this whole drama, this whole NNPC migrating into NNPC Limited, or the whole concept of the National Oil Company?
Thank you. Well, first I'll say that your concept of what the oil industry is the right one, and is what I always tell people, that for the ordinary Nigerian, for you and I and the man on the street, the oil industry is known by when they drive into a station and can get their fuel easily, or they need cooking gas, or they need cooking fuel, and they get it effortlessly in an affordable and sustainable way. So the downstream is the most important part. The downstream being the products area where people are buying things and utilizing them. The upstream is selling, the sale of crude oil. And that is where we have been concentrated all this time, without thinking about the development aspects, without thinking about the fact that we have to ensure that the crude oil that God gave us and the gas is utilized for the benefit of the people. The people only get the benefit when the downstream refineries are working, the oil is being used for petrochemicals, for products, and different things to make life easier. So far in Nigeria, you can see that that downstream part has been not in an optimal condition, and we have concentrated very much on the crude oil aspect. We've also had the oil industry really, really dominated by government and government considerations and government influences. These are things that the reform is expected to address. We found that for years now, the reform has been on for 13, 14 years. It's just coming to commencement with the Petroleum Industry Act. And one of the principal things, fundamental activities, was conducted yesterday with the external transformation, so to speak, of the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation into the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited. Now, that external consideration actually underlies the fact that NNPC is now going to be running like a commercial enterprise in line with commercial considerations. So this should mean that NNPC is no longer like a cash cow that the government goes to when it needs something. It means that it should be able to operate commercially, having its own money, delivering returns to the government, acting on behalf of its shareholder. Its shareholder is the government. But you know that many of us don't realize that the government really works for us. That's what it's supposed to be. So that's why you find they are saying 200 million Nigerians, so to speak. So it should be delivering returns. It should be delivering maximum returns and maximum benefits. Its subsidiaries should now be functioning optimally and actually generating revenue. So we aren't reinventing the wheel. I think we're the last to get on this bandwagon because it has been happening all over the place. If it really works, because what we have is the beginning, if it really works, NNPC will now start to function. It will now start to function in a commercial way. it will now start to function in such a way that it's thinking about optimizing its revenues, delivering dividends, positive, when I say dividends now, not the money now, but the positive sustainable development dividends to the people. So we should see a lot different. But what we now have is a name change. And following the name change, there have to be a lot of different things happening.
Well, a lot of people seem to be confused a little bit about the process. There was a time that somebody gunning for president came and said he was going to sell NNPC, and everybody started shouting that he was going to bring his family and friends and sell it to them and what. With the current process now, with this change of commercialization, I think there are two things that we're looking at: privatization and commercialization, which I understand are two different things. Yes, exactly. But a lot of people seem to be confused about those things because there's a fine line. So, with the commercialization now, are we gradually inching towards that privatization? Because if it is a
gradually,
limited company, yes, it might. Will there be a period whereby it might be traded publicly so that shares can be sold and investors coming in?
Yes, I think that I've forgotten what his name is now, but the GMD, the person who was GMD when NNPC was just NNPC, actually did talk about that there is the expectation. If one looks at the Petroleum Industry Act and you look at the portion on NNPC, you'll see that NNPC, there is a provision that is allowing shares to be sold in NNPC, and that will happen gradually. But what it is now is commercialization. Commercialization is basically a company acting more in alignment with commercial considerations and acting more like a standard company. So you see it's NNPC Limited. It's actually a karma company. It actually means that it can be regulated. We will see whether that is really so if we see a sanction imposed on NNPC at a point, or we see that NNPC is actually acting totally in alignment with the other companies. Because like I say, action is what one has to look at and not cosmetic treatment. So that's commercialization. Privatization is the act of the government actually divesting itself, not necessarily of all, but of some. And practically every national oil company has a measure of privatization in. There are some companies we know, like British Petroleum. British Petroleum started off as a national oil company. But now you have even the national oil companies in the OPEC countries having a part being divested and given to private citizens. I think Nigeria's problem is which private citizens exactly. And who. And is it just another ploy for somebody to basically buy off the Nigerian patrimony? It's up to us to make sure that doesn't happen, and to make sure that we are talking about a company whose shares will be listed on the Nigerian Stock Exchange. It will probably then, since the GMD said that it would be listed, if it's going to be listed on the stock exchange, it means that its shares will be offered in the same way as we can buy Seplat shares, for example, or we can buy shares of Oando in the stock exchange. That is now what will happen. And I would hope that what the government will do is to put ceilings. It doesn't help much with big investors. They will use different names. Exactly. But at least if you put ceilings on the amount of shares that any single legal entity or human being can buy, that will help certain people from cornering all the available shares.
Listening to you with rapt attention, and I'm trying to, if possible, sort of leave my frame and trying to ask you this question from the point of view of the ordinary Nigerian. We have seen government's various attempts at commercializing, or if you like, privatization, and the stories have not been very, very palatable. The last of them have been the Nigerian Air, which seem to have spent so much money on a name change without really having metal plates on the ground. And some skeptics are of the view that if you want to transform so much to a form of operation that is strange to the average civil or public servant, that you probably needed more than a name change. You also needed a management change that thinks differently, that have always operated in the private sector. But in this unveiling, the understanding is that the board of the old NNPC that are stuck in the old ways, it's now the board of the new company. The management of the old NNPC basically just take a name change or a baptism from what was Saul to now Paul. How does it change anything?
Well, it's good. The example you gave now, Saul to Paul, actually had somebody changing fundamentally. So, having said that, it's day 2 of NNPC Limited. So, I don't want to go too heavy on that, but I know what you're saying. We have seen a name change and nothing else. We have seen structures remaining the same. But that is what we see now. It's actually too soon for us to assess them. I think this conversation would be very, very worthwhile as from 30 days' time, because then we'd be able to see what has been done internally. But change management is very difficult, and it is characterized by failure if you really don't work at it. So there have to be really, really concerted efforts. I'm sure there's a lot happening, but I'm also sure that we don't really know. I didn't hear much about that, but it has to be happening. If it does not happen, there will only be a name change, and there will be nothing else. There has to be, it doesn't just happen. There have to be definite concerted efforts in different ways to ensure that NNPC becomes limited and commercial in spirit and in truth, and operates within the framework of an entire industry that is really presently going through spasms as a result of the change. But the change has to be inevitable in every one of the institutions of the new petroleum industry.
Well, the NNPC, the NNPC formerly, was it's other subsidiaries, and it was a regulator in the...
It wasn't supposed to be, that's the problem. Because NNPC could not stick to its own lane, it was becoming everything. That's why on the day of the launch, they announced that NNPC has directed or has given new product prices. Please, that's a thorough irregularity under this new system, because it has no business talking about petroleum prices. That is the job of the midstream and downstream authority, clearly so. So NNPC should not be telling us anything about the prices of products or whatever. It should be focusing on what it's supposed to be doing, and that is being Nigeria's oil company. And it should be focusing on trying to grow NPDC, which is a flagship company of that flagship company of NNPC Limited. It has no business in certain areas. It has no business being a regulator of any type. That was a huge anomaly. But because in Nigeria we tend not to correct such lapses, we allow those things, it was allowed to continue. And then again, we need to remember the origin of NNPC. The origin of NNPC had NNPC at a point, the NNOC, which was the precursor to NNPC, and the Ministry of Petroleum were sort of combined together to form NNPC, and that is why the old NNPC Act had NNPC Limited and had the Petroleum Inspectorate, which was the regulator of the industry. So we had the regulator and the commercial all together in one entity, and that is what NNPC is used to. And that is what change management has to attack.
I was imagining also, taking a different frame this time, that I was a state governor whose only major source of income is a monthly FAC allocation, a basket until recently where a major bulk of the contribution into that basket was the old NNPC, as it were. And now this is changing because they will not be making remittances, but they will be paying dividends. And my understanding of how dividends are structured, they will have to come at the end of a calendar year after an audit. And I'm just wondering how the states would work given our current structure, our current reality, I don't know how all of that will play out. Everybody sees the NNPC as a cash cow. And so everybody catches fever if for whatever reason they are not bringing anything to the basket, as we have seen from January to date. How does this whole dividend thing plays out for states and its expectations from what used to be the old NNPC to what we currently have?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that dividends don't have to be yearly. You can actually have quarterly dividends. That's number one. The second thing I will have to say is that state governors have to please become creative and realize that their internally generated revenue is important. Lagos realizes that, Rivers realizes that, and my governor in Edo State realizes that very much. And all these governors have concentrated on that. So there are some states that are not dependent on internally generated revenue. Those other ones have got to get innovative. If you are in a state that hasn't got enough internally generated revenue, why hasn't it got it? It's a development problem and a development issue, and it is something that you're supposed to be tackling, because you're not supposed to just have poor people in your state that have no money and that can do nothing. Your business as a governor is to ensure that your people get better. So I think there's no way out. It's definitely very untenable for you to have states that are totally dependent on an allocation from somewhere. And that has been one of the huge problems that has stopped NNPC from being commercial. It has to be now. Another point is that Nigeria has to realize that we can't be looking onto the oil industry for everything. We're innovative. We are blessed. We are really brilliant people. Outside, we're just excelling all over the place. We don't have to be looking at one industry when there's so much around. And in fact, you find that the young are not doing that. The young are not focusing on the oil industry.
Interesting perspective there from our guest professor, a senior advocate of Nigeria. And myself and Ibrahim have the first-hand benefit of a masterclass this morning. If you're with us at home, it's a wonderful experience to be in the presence of a professor on petroleum economics. Please stay with us.
Sorry,
we will take
petroleum law.
Petroleum law, correct. We'll take a breather. When we return, this conversation continue. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying with us. We've been discussing the whole transformation, or if you like, change, taking place at the NNPC. It's been a matter of concern for everybody, from the high and the mighty to those of us at the bottom of the pyramid, if there are any such thing. Different interpretations for what we have heard. Everything that has to do with the petroleum industry come in such languages that are very difficult to deconstruct. If they are not talking of offshore dichotomy, they're talking 200 nautical miles something, and now we are here and we are listening to commercialization as different from privatization or commercialization leading into privatization, whatever you make of it. My question to you, Professor, would then be, you have been there before and you're here. From everything that is happening, from this change that seems to happen, do you think there is sufficient education in the public sphere, both to the educated and the ordinary Nigerian, in understanding what amount of transformation is taking place and what is to be expected at the end of this journey?
Oh, no, the answer is clearly no. There's not enough information outside. But I think we need to situate my answer against that being the problem of Nigeria and the ordinary Nigerian. My nature is curious. I am a curious person. I ask a lot of questions. And I'm always being told by people, oh, I know what I'm doing. When you ask people, that's a very familiar thing, that I know what I'm doing. Nobody says you don't know what you're doing. Explain what you are doing. You don't even know whether I know more than you about this, but I want to know your particular, what your particular way is. So in Nigeria, we aren't that great at that. So the seamstress will tell you, I know what I'm doing. The vulcanizer will tell you that. Everybody, even the doctors who should know better, will often tell you that they're not supposed to. Everybody's supposed to explain themselves. So against that background, you'll find that everyone here talks too little. There are certain things that the people should know. And, you know, down to the lowest person. So I personally am a believer that there is nothing that cannot be explained in simple language to anybody. So there's nothing like, oh, you can't understand this. If you can understand a language, you should be able to understand practically every concept if it's broken down to you in simple enough language. So we haven't done that. That's really a role for you people, you know, the people in communications, working side by side with many of these people, because it's important for the ordinary man in the street, and I mean, none of you are the ordinary men in the street. Really, for the real bottom of the pyramid people to be able to understand and flow with a lot of this. But the thing is that knowledge is power. And sometimes in some societies we don't want that, because you'll find that the ordinary person, once the ordinary person understands that, look, I shouldn't be spending half my salary on kerosene, something should be happening. He might react, he might demand his rights. He needs to know that certain things are in fact his rights, that they aren't privileges. Right now, we ask very politely for things that belong to us. We need to learn to still ask politely, but recognize that the things belong to us. So there's not enough news. So I think that probably there'll be a better media campaign, or a big media campaign to explain precisely what everything is. But right now, the industry is going through massive change. Change is not easy.
Indeed.
All right, well, talking about having the proper understanding of what's going on, and you actually made a very, very good point there about simple language.
Yes.
A lot of us really prefer to be spoken in simple language. Just like Sunday, we made mention earlier, we were talking about commercialization, privatization, onshore, offshore, mainstream, upstream, downstream, all these things. They sound a bit confusing, and all at once, all this information is coming at you all at once. So let's try and break it down a little bit for the bottom of the pyramid guys. Since you said we are not part of it.
You are not.
Yes. Yeah. So let's try and break it down. What is the new NNPC Limited? The new NNPC Limited now. What is it to the ordinary Nigerian?
The new NNPC Limited is now an oil company that should become, at the end of the day, like Shell, or like, let me say ENI, because under ENI, there's a national oil company there, you know, which is ELF, or like British Petroleum.
Saudi Aramco.
Yes, or Saudi Aramco should become like that. In fact, I sometimes avoid Saudi Aramco a little bit, because people still think of it totally as government, but and the government plays a strong role, heavy role there, but it's still commercialized. Practically everywhere, everybody is commercialized to an extent. Like I've said, commercialized means that you are not a cash cow, but you are thinking more like a normal company. Statoil, for example, was pure Norwegian national oil company. It's now driven by commercial considerations. So what it means now is that NNPC is becoming a company that will be giving dividends. So it means it's become an accountable company. It means that it's NNPC Limited. It's subject to our company laws. So you are going to be able to require annual statements from it. You're going to require, it's going to be required to abide by our governance principles and all the different principles and laws and regulations that apply to other companies. It cannot be a regulator. Once we all know that, if anything that sounds like regulation comes from NNPC, you know that something is wrong. The regulation has got to come from the regulators. And even with that, you have to make sure that the regulation on price for petroleum is not coming from the upstream commission, because upstream means crude oil. Downstream and midstream means products. And usually those are the things touching you and I. So that is, you know, that I think is the basic thing first.
Okay. Moving slightly away from the NNPC maybe to the midstream, downstream. We we've been inundated with all kinds of trouble. I like the way you started your opening statements about things that should be there that are not there, whether it is cooking gas or kerosene or fuel. Today, we're talking aviation fuel. It used to be very strange. Today, airlines are threatening to shut down or even be given a license to import. Their manufacturers are asking for license to bring in their own diesel. Yesterday, it was the grid collapse. We are not sure what exactly that is, but at some point, we know the Jankos we're talking about, not enough gas to power some of these machines. What is your evaluation of how that midstream, downstream sector has performed with regards to making products available, which does appear to be the chief responsibility of that place? Does it just stop at making the regulations and folding their arms and however the market decides to play, it plays? Or there is something that it is supposed to do to actually guarantee the availability of products?
Well, first of all, that agency is too new for us to be saying anything. It's the newest of the agencies because Nigeria has concentrated on the upstream. We've concentrated on selling crude oil. In fact, when we had refineries, we first started having refineries, then some people at the top found that there's lots of money to be made from importing petroleum products. So in the 80s, the refineries were allowed to go down. They have never come up again for different reasons. So we have had a terrible downstream and midstream. We've had an opaque system, opaque systems have been working there. It has just been in a terrible mess. So in comes the authority and you throw the authority into this mess. It's still right in the mess. It's got to make some sense of it. And when you throw it in and then you take out one of the primary issues that have to be dealt with if you are really seriously talking about reform, and that's this subsidy. So you throw them in, you say the subsidy is still going to continue. We know that with the subsidy, we're subsidizing the entire region completely. We know that that is thoroughly opaque. We know that there are all sorts of very funny, very odd practices that happen there, cargoes being paid for. I mean, all sorts of things. We know that there are too many issues right now. So one, I don't want to blame the midstream and downstream. Like I say, it's too soon. We need to see what is going to happen at a point in time. But we need to realize that energy in Nigeria is in a mess. I do not actively know a country in a worse shape than us. I mean, people will take me up and say, oh, places like Liberia, for example, you just have grid in the capital and there's no grid outside. But that's not the point. Where we have the grid, is it functional? I mean, we're characterized by grid, going down. Every time we have grid collapse. It's in fact become the norm this year. So you can see it's evidence that things are worsening. We have very little energy at our disposal, electricity, and that's what I've been talking about. In fact, at the conference I mentioned it, and I was misquoted to an extent. People lost what I was saying to an extent, but we need massively more energy now than we're talking about. So when you're talking about 30 megawatts, nonsense, ridiculous. You're talking about all sorts of rubbishy amounts. I talked about 161 megawatts being used just for Times Square in America, for example. So we don't have enough of it. So that's a big issue. But honestly speaking, I think that the primary problem that we have there, if you're going to fundamentals, is that we've never treated energy holistically in Nigeria. So you find it's fragmented. You find there's NNPC there and there's the Ministry of Petroleum. You find there's the Energy Commission of Nigeria and it's under the Ministry of Science and Technology. You have the Ministry of Power there. You have some other, Ministry of Power has its different bodies there. Then you have NERC, you have all these. There's a lot of fragmentation. People say that there are places where they come together. I've heard this when I say this at conferences and venues, but we aren't seeing the difference, because if there was any synergistic correlation, if they were actually working together in harmony, we'd see more than we are seeing. But what we're seeing here is dismal. That is the truth of the matter.
All right. Well, now since we've expanded a little bit and talking about energy in
Yes.
general, I think it's time for me, it's an opportunity for me to sneak in this question. You say we don't have enough.
No, not at all.
We don't have enough of it. And we have a grid that is actually not working and it's collapsing here and there. So the question is twofold. A lot of people have thrown out this idea of having smaller grids.
Oh, yeah, mini grids.
Mini
yes.
grids, yes, in different
And
parts of the
regional
country.
grids,
Regional
yes.
grids, yes, exactly. So that might be able to solve that issue. And other people are actually talking about why don't we move away currently from what we are doing and start focusing on other sources of energy, like trying to generate like renewable energy and all this. Where do you think we should actually focus on?
Well, that's why everybody's talking about an energy mix, and a lot of people are missing the point and saying, no, we must stick on natural gas, we must stick on petroleum, we must develop our gas. We must develop our gas, but gas is not going to go to some remote area where the people are very poor, and they have a right to energy. The same as you and I, they have a right. They will not develop and move from being very poor to being people with sustainable livelihoods. So it's important to understand that energy makes a fundamental difference to your life. The difference in our lives and the lives of the poor people at the bottom is energy. Energy, and if I had time, I would dissect it to you, but I don't. Energy makes a difference. You can tell a developed country, if you know nothing about it, just go and look at its energy use and you can tell. So obviously, anybody looks at Nigeria's energy use, you see 13 megawatts installed capacity, and let us not talk about generated, which is like 4. And that's a very severely underdeveloped country. It's a country in spasms. Energy kwashiorkor actually is what Nigeria is suffering from, because we should have multiples of that. And if you are talking about that which will give you quality living, a lot more, you'll find that what we're generating, it can't even give one city quality living. And that's why every day it goes off. So you do need to think about the energy mix and what will ensure that every Nigerian gets energy. And that is where you're going to need renewable energy at a point in time. Yeah.
Very quickly before we bring this conversation to a wrap, listening to you, I get the sense that it is not only the NNPC that needed a change of name, if you like, or a change of focus. I mean, we should be having some kind of synergy between the Ministry of Power, the Ministry of Petroleum, and all other agencies that seem to be playing intervening role on what should guarantee energy. What's your take on what should be the ideal model?
Actually, ideally, we should have a Ministry of Energy. That is really the truth, and put the different energy things in one place so we can deal with it holistically, so we won't have distortions, so that the turf wars will be less. The wars about power, I mean, not power in energy sense, but this type of power.
Power struggle.
Yes, power struggles will be less. That's really what we should do.
Interesting perspective there. There are professors and there are professors. This is one we are very sure bears witness to everything, every preface before her name. We've been talking to Professor Yinka Omorogbe. Again, I will apologize if by any strength
You did well.
I pronounced that wrongly. A senior advocate of Nigeria, and she was the former secretary and legal advisor to the NNPC of old between 2019 and 2011, and also a former Attorney General and Commissioner of Justice in Edo State. It's a pleasure to have had you provide perspective on this very delicate, very confusing, very difficult area. We hope to have you again in the studio, particularly, you know, to discuss energy kwashiorkor when the time permits. It's been a pleasure to have you join us on this program. It's been a wonderful ride from 7 a.m. to this point. Let's do this again tomorrow, God's willing. I am Sunday Michael Ogu.
All right, it's been Daybreak on Trust TV. Join us again tomorrow where we prepare to do this all over again. I am Ibrahim Yusuf.